This is our final lecture for the semester, and this chapter is going to talk about, kind of the progression of government policy here in the United States. So first, we'll have to define what policy is, and this is kind of a subsection of studying government, and this is actually what my field of study is public policy. When we talk about policy, what we're talking about is how does government get the work done? What are its plans? What is it putting into action? Public policy, laws, rules, statutes, things it can use to enforce things to accomplish its goals. And so sometimes they can do this through rewarding citizens. Sometimes they can do this through punishing citizens or punishing businesses or whatever it is. So essentially, it's just laying out a plan to accomplish a goal that government wants to accomplish. And so those of us that study public policy, we study how well this is working, the implementation process. Is it accomplishing the goals it's saying it's going to accomplish? Could it be done better? That's what public policy is. And there's three broad areas that people tend to talk about when we talk about government policy. Economic policy, how well is the economy doing? Social policy, this typically has to do with welfare, education, healthcare, all those things of, ensuring that citizens are taken care of. And of course, foreign policy, which is how we deal with the rest of the world. And there's friendly peace policy, like trade relationships and things that are mutually beneficial. And then we have military and defense policy, which is when things aren't going the way we want, and sometimes we have to resort to the use of force. Economic and social policy are domestic policy because that is, how are things going here at home? So like right now, this would include COVID-19 and how the government is addressing it, the plans it's laid out to, keep the population safe. We're talking a lot about racial equality, and so that's part of domestic policy that's getting a lot of attention right now. We're talking about kids going back to school in August, and so education policy is a big part of domestic policy that we're all talking about right now. So this is how are things going at home? And then foreign policy, how are we interacting with the rest of the world? And policies have to be backed by some type of enforcement mechanism. Sometimes it's a reward, whether it's, getting tax breaks or something like that, or punishment. We look at criminal justice as a domestic policy. And so, if you don't comply with the law, there's punishment. If we're talking about environmental policy, if a corporation is polluting too much, we fine them and things like that. So that's how we enforce a lot of our domestic policy. Things get a little more difficult when we're dealing with foreign countries. Because countries are sovereign. They are not, they're not under our command. So we can't force them to do what we want them to do. But there are certain countries that, have kind of, that have been on kind of the outside of our good graces, I guess you could say. Countries like Iran, North Korea, Venezuela. And for some of these countries, we use like economic sanctions where we don't do business with them or we don't trade with them. We try and get our allies to do the same. And the point is to use these punishments to make things hard on them so they fall in line and do what the rest of the world wants them to do. Now, the United States has always been criticized about, using sanctions to try and force the rest of the world to go along with its policy and things like that. And that's not an unfounded criticism. Depending on where you're from in the world, you don't necessarily view the United States the same way we as American citizens do. So, but globalism is something that has increased because of technology. Globalism is just the idea that we are not the only country on this planet. That today we have complex networks of technology, of trade relationships, of military alliances, and things like that. And so the idea is that the better we get along as countries, sovereign countries, we can maintain peace. But when countries kind of step out of line and don't go along with everyone else, then the rest of the world can use things like sanctions and stuff like that to hold them accountable. Um, since World War II, the United States has traditionally been seen as kind of the leader of the free world. We emerged from World War II being very strong militarily, economically. We have post World War II, we have this population that's that's becoming higher educated. We have people who are buying homes and getting better education, K through 12. And so we set ourselves up post World War II to kind of, um, you know, uh, be successful in the rest of the 20th century. Now, there is a lot of debate as to whether we are still in that position today. It's very easily argued that China is in that position as well. China has, in the past, couple of decades, their economy has boomed, while our economy has, it's not doing bad, but it is kind of plateaued a bit. And so China's enjoying an economic growth where we have kind of slowed down. And now, during from the 1960s to the early 1990s, there was the whole concept of the Cold War, which was the United States and the Soviet Union kind of vying to be the number one influence in the world. Today, you could argue that the United States and China are having a similar kind of unspoken competition where we both want to, exert our influence and our will on the rest of the world. And that's leading to, especially under President Trump, has led to, the complication of our relationship with China. And so that's why foreign policy is very important because we tend to sometimes in the United States forget we're not the only country in the world and that other countries don't have to do what we tell them to do. So we'll talk a little bit more about that here in a bit. First, we'll start with economic policy. So when we're talking about economic policy, we have four main goals that we tend to talk about. Promote economic stability. We don't like disruption to the economy, which is what we are experiencing right now. And much of the world is experiencing it, but not necessarily to the same degree. The situation with COVID and businesses having to shut down. And now, we have some businesses that can operate, like bars and things like that. And people are, there's high unemployment and people are kind of questioning, what's going to happen in the future, and that leads to economic instability where people aren't hiring as much. Some people aren't getting a steady income. So that can disrupt the stock market and business and what businesses are, what type of moves they're wanting to make or money they're going to spend. All of these things, the economy is a very complex thing because so much goes into it. But we do good as a nation when the economy is stable. And right now our economy is definitely not stable. To stimulate economic growth. We do well when the economy is growing. A lot of you are, too young to remember the 90s, or maybe some of you weren't even alive in the 90s. The 90s was when we had the first kind of tech boom. The internet was everybody was getting a computer and had the internet in their home. And so we saw all these startup companies starting internet service provider companies or online retailers and all this kind of stuff. So there was this huge boom where lots of people got very wealthy. because of the internet. And, through most of the 90s, the economy of the United States was growing very rapidly. Um, the tech boom starts to slow down in the 2000s, and then some companies go away. We see new companies, rise, like Amazon and things like that. And then we get to 2008, where we have this housing bubble where banks and financial lenders were making, kind of questionable loans to people to buy homes, to buy vehicles and stuff like that. And when that collapsed, it took the economy a while to recover, and it affected all different, industries and sectors of the economy. And so we have to be careful sometimes that growth isn't leading to a bust, because sometimes we put so much money into something, and then when that becomes unstable, it can take the rest of the economy down with it. And that's what we saw in 2008. And a lot of people feel like we are, we're dealing with some of that now as well, where these major internet companies like Amazon and stuff like that, they're going to be okay. But the problem is that they're taking up so much of the space in the economy that other businesses have a tough time surviving. If you look at what social media and tech has done to, you had all these internet startup companies, and then the big ones bought the smaller ones. And so we see more and more consolidation of the internet into just a few hands. Amazon has bought up so many different retailers, and real brick and mortar stores have trouble competing with Amazon. And so the economy is so complex, and there's things that you wouldn't think of kind of come out of left field and take it down. And we do well when the economy is growing. But right now, our economic growth is pretty stagnant, whereas a country like China is kind of going through the boom that we went through 20 years ago. Number 3, promote business development. This is another one where we're talking a lot about, billionaires and, should we have so many billionaires and things like that. The problem is that the economy is more fair when businesses are not consolidated under one umbrella. We call those monopolies, when one company controls an entire type of business. We've seen them in the railroad and oil production. We've seen some in tech. For a while, Microsoft was accused of having a monopoly on the internet because the way Windows was, when you installed Windows on a computer, it provided everything you needed for the most part to search the internet, to do your work on the computer, this, that, and the other. So other companies had trouble competing with Microsoft because Windows was kind of this full package where you didn't need much else. And so that kind of, opened the door after these monopoly hearings with Microsoft. It kind of opened the door for competition from Google and, other places like that. And so one of the biggest criticisms today is that we have if you think of a company like Amazon, it's hard to think of, a thing that Amazon doesn't have its hand in. Amazon started out first as just a site that sold books, and then they grew to selling other goods. Then they started providing internet services, like cloud storage and Amazon Prime Video, and they buy up smaller companies and integrate it into the Amazon business plan. And so the problem is that if we're not promoting a diverse business development plan, that it can lead to the formation of monopolies where new people trying to enter the economy with their business ideas, there's no room for them because we already have these massive corporations providing every service that people need. So it makes it harder to compete in the economy in a free market. And then 4, protect employees and consumers. This is another thing that, we discourage monopolies because When one corporation controls so much, um, they can set the price, and you essentially have to pay the price if you want the product. This was the problem with, this is why we don't want one corporation producing oil and gas, because if we only had, say, we only had Exxon, then Exxon could charge you whatever they wanted for gas. Or let's say that we only had one internet provider that we all had to get our internet from. Well, they could charge one price, and if we want the internet, we have to pay it. So this is part of the role of economic policy, is to make sure that employees and consumers are protected, not just from price gouging, but from unsafe products, unsafe business practices, and then, of course, employees getting a fair wage, getting benefits that they are entitled to. Some people believe, this is an area where we're not doing a good job as a country as a whole. If you think about the minimum wage, we haven't raised the minimum wage in this country in probably 2 decades, and in most places in this country, it is impossible to rent an apartment anywhere in the United States for someone who makes minimum wage, even if they're working full time. And so our the ability for people to work, to take care of themselves and things like that has become much more difficult in our country. And that's why, for probably the past 10 years, raising the minimum wage has been a hot button issue that we've been talking about. All right. Public goods. Goods or services provided by the government because they are not supplied by the market, are supplied in sufficient quantities. A lot of people, we've been having a conversation about healthcare and whether healthcare should be a public good. Right now, healthcare is part of the private sector, where we all get a job. As part of our job, our employers, if you get a good job and you work full time, your employer has to provide you a health plan. But your employer, has to pay into your health plan to cover some of it for you. And of course, they're going to want to provide something that is cost beneficial to them. So most employers are not going to be paying for the top tier healthcare plan for their employees. Buying a healthcare plan on your own outside of the employer model is cost prohibitive to most people. But a lot of people argue that healthcare should be a public good because medical care is not something that we can really debate whether we need. At any time, we're all going to need some type of healthcare. And so, in a public good situation, the government would provide healthcare. But a lot of people don't trust the government to provide it properly. So this is one of those situations where we're having a lot of debate about where we should go as a country on something like healthcare. But, public goods are things that the government provides because either they are a necessity, so human beings shouldn't have to compete in the market for these things, or the private sector can't supply them in a big enough quantity to meet the demand. The gross domestic product is what we judge the health of an economy on. The GDP is the total value of goods and services produced within a country. We use this to measure, how well a country is doing. The United States right now still has the largest GDP in the world. I believe this is probably about a year or two old, but when I made this slide, the GDP of the United States was $19.39 trillion. But China is rapidly catching up. You can look at China. Theirs at the same time was $12.24 trillion. So they're not too far behind us. And one of the things that is helping China in this regard is that we have shipped a lot of our production and manufacturing of goods overseas. And so a lot of the goods that we consume are no longer produced in the United States. They're produced in places like China, Latin America, Southeast Asia, places where labor is cheap. And so that benefits the country that is doing the manufacturing, but actually hurts us. If you look back to the beginning of the pandemic, when people were talking about the shortage of ventilators, the shortage of face masks, and things like that. Well, the problem is that most of our ventilators and our face masks are manufactured in China. So we could not get them rapidly because our corporations, our manufacturing infrastructure was not set up to make them because we have depended so long on buying these from other countries. And so that's one of the things that can happen when a country like ours becomes so much of a consumer nation rather than a nation that is producing its own goods. All right, some of the goals of economic policy. Again, these are things that we look to measure the health of the economy. Employment. We hear a lot, especially when people are evaluating the job that a president is doing. They talk a lot about the unemployment rate. Employment we look at to see how well the economy is functioning, because if our economy is doing well, if businesses are doing well, then they're creating jobs. They are manufacturing a product, a good, a service, whatever it is. And if people are buying it and there's high demand, then they need more employees to meet that demand. So when unemployment is low, it's a sign that the economy is doing well because, people can find jobs very easily. They can find good, well-paying jobs easily, jobs that can sustain, to meet all their needs, whether it's paying their rent, paying their car note, being able to pay all their bills. That's what we want in an economy that's doing well. One of the things that has changed in our history, though, is the type of economy we have in the United States. If we go back again to post-World War II, the reason why we had a boom and became, the richest and most influential country in the world was because we were the ones manufacturing goods for the rest of the world. Even during World War II, we were manufacturing things for the rest of the world, military equipment, stuff like that. Post-World War II, there's a lot of innovation in the United States where we're inventing things like the television and, the computer and new, more efficient automobiles and things like that. And we were making them here in the United States and shipping them to the rest of the world. That's not the case anymore. Today, the United States is a consumer-based economy, which means that our economy does well when people buy things, but we're not necessarily making those things here in the United States. Even American cars, this is one of those things I remember growing up. I was born in 81. So I remember growing up in the 80s and, Americans didn't trust foreign cars. It took a while for, the Japanese cars to break into the American market because they were viewed as lower quality, not as powerful, all this kind of stuff. And everybody, bought American cars because we believed that American cars were the best cars in the world. Well, today, even American cars aren't made in the United States. Most manufacturers, while some of them are manufactured in the United States, a lot of manufacturers have plants in Mexico and Latin America and other places where they can manufacture them cheaper and bring them back into the U.S. to sell to American citizens. Most of the things you buy at Target and Walmart are not manufactured in the United States. They're manufactured in other places. So businesses are manufacturing their goods in other countries and they're paying a much lower wage to those employees to manufacture the goods because they don't have the same minimum wage laws and employee protections that we have in the United States. And then they bring those cheap goods to the United States, mark the price up, and sell them to American citizens. And so our economy does well when American citizens have money to spend. If you look at what we're going through right now, the future's kind of uncertain for a lot of people. And so people are not spending money on frivolous things. Most people are just buying the necessities to take care of their family. Especially when we were in lockdown, you didn't even really have the choice to buy frivolous things because only grocery stores were open. And so when Americans feel uncertain, they tend to not spend as much money, hang on to it, save it for a rainy day. And that's money that's not going into the economy. So when that happens, what we're seeing right now is a lot of businesses like restaurants and bars and stuff like that have gone out of business because they don't have money coming in. Companies like retailers, like, clothing retailers and, places you would go to in the mall and stuff like that, they're closing and they're laying off employees because people aren't buying those things. Really, the only companies doing well right now are Walmart, Target, grocery stores, Amazon, places like that, because they sell necessities. But when Americans are uncertain about the future, we tend to not buy those frivolous things that we want, but aren't necessarily, life-sustaining type things. And so that's why our economy is very uncertain right now. If you look back to 2008, this was the last big kind of economic crisis we went through, the recession of 2008. Our economy lost 8 million jobs, and this happened right during the transition from President George W. Bush to President Obama. And again, this happened because a lot of financial institutions made bad investments. The housing market was collapsing, and we had a lot of these giant financial companies and banks who were on the verge of collapsing. And if we allowed them to fail, they could have taken the entire economy down with them, just like what happened during the Great Depression. So as President Obama's coming into office, President Obama and Congress passed what's called the Recovery and Reinvestment Act to promote economic growth and save jobs. And they essentially prop up these corporations to prevent them from failing, requiring them to meet certain conditions, to start hiring employees back and things like that. And it actually does save the economy and pull us out of the recession. It's not immediate. It took a few years to kind of get things back to where they were. But a lot of people fear that, these financial institutions make these risky investments and decisions all the time, that we could be on the verge of another one of these type of situations. When President Obama left office in 2016, the employment rate was below 5%. I think the unemployment rate right now is somewhere around 13%, which, it's high because of the pandemic. President Trump can't be entirely blamed for the situation we're in because he could not have anticipated COVID-19. Now, how his administration has responded to it, that's on his administration. But they definitely could not have anticipated that the country would be going through a pandemic at the end of his first term. The unemployment rate, one thing that makes it a little unreliable is that it doesn't take into account people who have stopped looking for work. The percentage of the unemployment rate is just people who are unemployed, looking for work, and reporting that information. Some people back in 2008, it was so hard to find a job back then, especially a good job, that some people just decided they would be stay-at-home parents or something like that and just pulled out of that job search entirely. And so the unemployment number doesn't include those types of individuals. but it does include measurements for people who are receiving unemployment and things like that. Unemployment is a benefit that we as citizens are entitled to. When you work, you pay into the system that pays unemployment, so you should never feel bad about having to use that service because you have already paid for it in your taxes that you pay out of your check. But unemployment is just it's meant to be a safety net, a temporary safety net, to pay you a percentage of the wages you were receiving. But there are conditions that come along with it. You do have to search for a job, submit that information weekly to like here in Texas, it would be the Texas Workforce Commission. So there are strings attached to it where you have to be looking for a job and take a job if it is offered to you and things like that. Inflation, when it happens at a time when we're going through an economic crisis, can have more negative side effects. Inflation is just the consistent increase of prices kind of across the board and can be a negative side effect when we have employment issues. So it's kind of counterintuitive. When we have high unemployment, it's typically because businesses are not doing too well. And one thing businesses will do sometimes is raise prices because if you look at a retailer like Walmart, they can sell goods very cheap because they sell a lot of them. So let's say that, something happens and people stop buying a certain good. Well, then to make the same amount of money from that good, they have to raise the price rather than lower the price. And so that's what has happened in a lot of sectors in our economy. Look at housing. I don't know how many of y'all are living in an apartment or have had to look for an apartment, but rent prices have doubled since probably in the last 10 years. Like, I moved to Fort Worth in 2009, and I got my first apartment with my wife. She's my girlfriend then. We got our first apartment in downtown Fort Worth for it was a one-bedroom apartment for $800 a month. That same apartment today is $1,600, and nothing has changed about the apartment itself. That's an insane increase. That's a 100% increase in 10 years, but yet people's wages haven't gone up. So that can be a problem in a consumer-based economy when prices go up, but people can't afford the new price. And that's what we've seen happen, especially in the housing market right now. Now, there's a couple of different approaches to economics that the different ideologies tend to prefer. First is what we call Kinesian Economics. This is named for John Maynard Keynes, who argued that the government can stimulate the economy by increasing public spending and cutting taxes. This is very much a liberal idea because it promotes the government getting involved in the economy. And this is kind of what FDR did to pull us out of the Great Depression. During the Great Depression, FDR started the public works program. And what it was a program to put people back to work by building the infrastructure for our country. So the government became the largest employer in the United States and hired people to build buildings, to build bridges, to build homes, to build roads, whatever it was the country needed, interstates, things like that. FDR put Americans to work building that infrastructure and paying them, with government money. And then cutting taxes to promote growth, among like manufacturers and retailers and things like that. But this requires that the government gets heavily involved in the economy. Conservatives do not like this idea. They would prefer that the government stay out of the economy. And this is what we call laissez-faire capitalism. This means that production, distribution are privately owned, so all of the corporations, businesses are all privately owned, operated for profit with minimal to no government influence. or interference. And so this would say that we should keep regulations low on business, we should keep taxes low on business, and that the government should not get involved in regulating prices and things like that. And the economy will decide who is a winner and who is a loser because consumers will make choices about what products they want. Both of these systems have flaws, and one of the problems with Keynesian is that it can lead to government corruption and government, taking advantage of people. But laissez-faire leaves the door open for monopolies and for the economic system itself to become abusive to the consumer. So neither one of them is perfect, and we kind of use a combination of the two here in our country. Supply side economics, economic theory, this is also embraced by conservatives, that reducing the marginal rate of taxation will create a productive economy by promoting work and investment that would be discouraged by higher taxes. This has a very popular name that some of you may be familiar with, and that's trickle-down economics. Reagan was big on this. Conservatives have embraced this idea that if you don't tax corporations, you don't tax the wealthy, they will take that money that they save in taxes, reinvest it in their businesses, and create more jobs and things like that. The problem is that it has never happened. We have never seen a situation where trickle-down economics has been put into place. When most of these corporations get these massive tax breaks, they keep the money for themselves. They use it to buy back their stock, so they control more of the company. So we've never seen this actually work in practice. And the biggest reason why it doesn't work in practice is greed, simple greed. So these are just a few terms that you may have heard and, didn't exactly know what they meant. We talked about fiscal policy. Or fiscal policy and is part of economic policy. It's government using taxation, using money, using its spending powers to try and manipulate the economy. And, that's what they did in 2009, was they passed that stimulus package to keep the economy stable. And so it's using the power of government to correct the economy. Tariffs, most people are familiar with. This is the taxes that we charge on goods that we import to the country. We have trade relationships with some countries where we keep tariffs low. One of the big things that most people remember about Trump's administration is that he's been big on, raising tariffs on China. Again, it would benefit the United States for China to pay higher taxes on their imported goods. The problem is that most of our goods come from China, and so it also raises the retail price on those goods as well. And then the country that we raise tariffs on can retaliate by raising tariffs on our goods, which hurts our manufacturers and farmers and things like that. Progressive taxation, the idea that as your income goes up, your taxes should be higher. This is one that you hear a lot from, say, like Bernie Sanders. He wants to tax billionaires more, have them pay a bigger share, and then use that money to invest in the country's healthcare, education, whatever it is. But this is a belief that as your income becomes higher, you should pay more in taxes because the country itself has enabled you to make this wealth that you have. Regressive taxation is when a tax affects lower income individuals heavier. This would be like the sales tax. If you are making $1 million a year, an 8.25% sales tax doesn't hurt you that much. But if you are a single mom with 3 kids, trying to, pay rent, buy school clothes, buy groceries, that kind of stuff, sales tax takes up a bigger percentage of your income at, say, a lower or middle class level income. So it is actually much heavier on the working class than it is on those who are wealthy. Redistribution. This is one of those things that conservatives hate. It's using tax policy, using revenue to reduce disparities between the wealthy and the poor. So our welfare programs are redistribution. We take tax money that we get and we use it to pay for, the food stamp program or housing vouchers for people to get affordable housing, or free lunches at school, whatever it is. It's using the power of the government to help the poor, to make sure that those basic needs are provided for. Loopholes, you may have heard Bernie Sanders again talk about this, where the problem with the wealthy, it's not that they don't have a high tax rate, because they do. The problem is that when you're wealthy, you can find a lot of loopholes from paying your fair share of taxes. So whether it is making large donations to charities, or finding all these little loopholes in the tax code. Someone like Jeff Bezos, who is a billionaire, the owner of Amazon, for the past few years has paid zero in taxes to the United States government, because he's wealthy enough to find tax people to find all of these loopholes for him. And so this is why someone like Bernie Sanders would say, billionaires are not helping this country. They're not contributing their fair share. It's because of loopholes in the tax code that allow them to not pay their taxes to the country. Monopolies we've talked about. Antitrust policy is just government policy to break up monopolies. All right. Social policy. So this is getting into the welfare type issues in our country. There's different types of welfare programs. One are contributory programs. These are the ones that we all pay money into. I know most of you, when you got your first job and you thought you were going to get that big paycheck, and then you look at your check and you see all this stuff that's taken out of your check and you don't understand it. That's what this is. We all pay into Medicare, we all pay into Social Security and things like that. So the percentage is based on the amount of money that you're bringing home. The percentage is the same pretty much across the board. But, if you're making minimum wage, your contribution is definitely much lower than someone making a much higher wage. Social Security is a program that was created during, the New Deal. During the Great Depression, we saw a lot of older Americans who were suffering because, they lost their life savings in the stock market crash when the banks started failing. And they, and their families went broke too, so there was no one to help them or take care of them. Sorry about that. So what Social Security is at its core is essentially a government-mandated retirement program. So that, when you get old, even if you didn't make enough to save sufficiently for your retirement, you have something. It's not much for a lot of people, but it's at least something. So we all pay into Social Security on every paycheck. We contribute a percentage of our wages. And when we retire or become disabled or something like that, you can get that money back. Right now, we pay about 7.65% that goes into Social Security and Medicare. And this is just so that, elderly people, 65 and older, they're not just completely destitute. They have some kind of money coming in. But again, my grandmother lives on Social Security with help from us, me and my sister and my brother. But she doesn't make much. She gets about $500 a month, maybe $600 a month since they raised it. But, it's barely enough to take care of just her necessities. So again, Social Security isn't something that you should rely on, because for most of us, we have, if you're smart, when you start your career, you start a 401k and a retirement and all that kind of stuff. That way you don't have to just depend on something like Social Security. It's something, but it's not much. Indexing is just adjusting that to account for the cost of living. And then Medicare is a form of health insurance for the elderly and disabled. So Once you turn 65, you become eligible for Medicare, which is a government-run healthcare program. And this is why if you've listened to Bernie Sanders, he talks about Medicare for all. So his plan is just to expand this for all Americans instead of having to wait until you're 65. But what this does is it provides for your basic health care. So you can get your checkups, you can get testing and stuff when you have a serious situation going on. It's not the best form of health insurance, but it at least is something. And then if you have more money, you can pay for upgrades to Medicare that pay for better care. But Medicare itself is at least a base amount of coverage so that people aren't going without health care if they need it. And then, like I said, unemployment falls into this as well. We've all paid into it, so you should never feel bad about using unemployment if you have to. Now, the programs that tend to be controversial are the ones that are non-contributory. These are the ones that help people who are poor regardless of whether they have paid into them or not. So this is based on need, not ability to pay. Medicaid is one of the big ones, and this is the one that cost the states a lot of money. Medicaid is a joint venture between the states and the federal government to provide medical care to those who are low income or have a disability. And so they share the responsibility. A big chunk of the money comes from the federal government, and the states have to make up the rest of that money. And you can see that on this chart here, the bigger your population, the more you're going to spend on Medicaid, because it just makes sense that you're going to have more people who need to use that service. You can see California has the biggest, expenditure for welfare. You can see New York, Texas, Florida, all high population states have large expenditures for welfare services. It makes sense because there are more people in those states. Medicaid tends to take up the most of a state's welfare budget, and it's just because medical care has become so expensive, and states are having to pay more and more into this program. Now, it's tough to qualify for Medicaid. If you are a family of four, typically you have to be making less than $21,000 a year for a family of four. It may have gone up a little bit, but that's what it used to be. So this is extremely poor. So it's not like it's just handed out to everybody. CHIP is another form or another component of Medicaid where if the parents don't qualify to get coverage for themselves through Medicaid, CHIP stands for Children's Health Insurance Program, and it's just so that those parents can get low-cost health care, at least for their children, so their children are getting medical care. So those two hand-in-hand do kind of account for most of a state's spending on welfare services. SNAP, Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. This is what we refer to as food stamps. It's just a program to provide the ability to buy food to families based on their needs. So they'll look at the income and evaluate how much a family qualifies from there. The rest of this, if you ever hear the term entitlements, that's what it's referring to, or these type of welfare programs. This goes hand in hand. If you go all the way back to the first couple of chapters, we talked about equality of opportunity. The problem with equality of opportunity is that if your most basic needs are not taken care of, then you don't really have the ability to succeed. So the belief is that our country should have these types of programs, excuse me, because if you do not have food, water, shelter, then everything else is unattainable. You're not going to get an education. You're not going to have good health. You're not going to succeed in life. And so the belief is that if the government at least provides for your most basic needs, food, shelter, some medical care. Then the rest you can focus on getting an education, going to college, improving your situation. And that's kind of the theory behind having a welfare program in a country. Now, there are lots of people with different opinions about welfare. The more conservative people are, they tend to think that we spend too much on these programs. We have some all the way to the extreme of Ted Cruz, who believes we should get rid of welfare altogether. And then, the other side would be someone like Bernie Sanders, who thinks that healthcare is a right and the government should be providing more to people to make the country more equal and equitable to everyone. So there's all kinds of opinions on this, and that's something that you may want to write about in your discussion post. All right, foreign policy. We're just going to do kind of a quick run through of how our foreign policy has changed throughout our history. So this is just how, our relations with other countries, and this can include diplomacy, which is negotiation, military, which is, usually war or some type of action, security, how we maintain our security here at home, human rights, trade, energy, all these things go into foreign policy. And foreign policy is it's directed by the president, but Congress typically has to approve agreements that we enter into with other countries. And then the bureaucracy, all those government agencies, are the ones who are going to handle implementing our foreign policy. The Constitution does give the president the ability to direct foreign policy, but one thing the president cannot do is declare war. The president can send troops to another country for a period of about 60 to 90 days without declaring war. And this is how we have quick actions that the president can order, like when SEAL Team 6 went in and got Osama bin Laden, back during President Obama's time in office. That was a very quick in and out type thing. So the president can do something like that. But the president cannot declare long-term war against another country. It takes Congress to approve that. So a big part of our foreign policy, revolves around security. And if we go back to the early stages of our country, during the 1700s and 1800s, we believed in a policy called isolationism, that the United States was far enough away from the rest of the world that we shouldn't get involved in their affairs. It didn't affect us. George Washington and many of the other founding fathers believed that, we were too young and still too weak to start getting involved in all of these conflicts, like the British and the French and the Spanish. It just wouldn't benefit us. And we were on the other side of the world, so we couldn't necessarily be pulled into them unless they attacked us. So we stuck to this policy of isolationism all the way up to World War I, with a few hiccups here and there, like the Spanish-American War and the French and Indian War and stuff like that. But we tried not to get pulled in as much as possible. World War I, we get pulled into a European conflict, because we said we weren't going to get involved, but we were providing non-military assistance to the British and the French, which led to some of our civilian vessels getting attacked by the Germans and others, and that pulled us into World War I. In World War II, we were committed to containment, which meant that we weren't going to get involved unless, someone attacked us directly. We believed that the Allies should contain this aggression that was happening in Europe, but we were not going to get involved. And then Japan decides to attack us at Pearl Harbor, and we decide we can't sit out anymore because now it has come to our shores. So we enter the war first, to retaliate for the attack on Pearl Harbor, but we get involved in both parts of the war, both in Japan and in Europe. And then, of course, most of you know the rest of that history. We emerge as, this kind of world superpower that people look to now, for protection, for guidance, all that kind of stuff. From World War One through the 80s, though, we have this kind of silent conflict with Russia called the Cold War. What happens during this period? There were two competing ideologies around the world. There was democracy and capitalism, which is what we embraced and most of the Western European countries embraced. And then there was communism. And the United States and most of the European countries did not want to see communism spread. And Russia, the Soviet Union, was communist and supported countries that were communist countries such as Vietnam, such as Cuba, China. They were building kind of their own alliance. And so the United States and Russia never directly went to war with each other, but they kind of used these other countries, as proxies for conflict. And so the world feared that if the United States and Russia ever went to war, that it would be, it would be the end of humanity, because both were building their nuclear arsenals for about 40 years or so, which we still have today. We have all of these nuclear weapons that were developed during the Cold War. We have enough nuclear weapons to destroy the world several times over. And the hope is that no countries ever come into conflict where they would actually use these against one another. A lot of Americans wanted a more aggressive approach to the Soviet Union, but the idea behind having nuclear weapons is what we call deterrence, that if you attack me, I'll attack you. And so it was called mutually assured destruction. If the United States and Russia ever went to war with one another and launched nuclear weapons, that was pretty much it. It was game over for everybody else, just as much as it was for the United States and Russia. Others were committed to appeasement, negotiations, giving in to demands here and there, so that we never went to full-scale war. Eventually, though, the Soviet Union falls apart from within. Many of the countries that were forced into the Soviet Union start to revolt and want their independence, and so the Soviet Union falls apart and loses the influence it had. Today, Russia is still a powerful country with a lot of influence, but it's not what it was at the height of the Soviet Union. And so now, we tend to focus on China more than we focus on Russia as kind of we're not necessarily in a Cold War with China, but we have kind of this silent conflict between us that's happening today, similar to how it was happening with the Soviet Union. Around the beginning of around 2000, our foreign policy was preoccupied with what we called non-state actors. So 9/11 was, an attack on the United States, where the World Trade Center was, Al Qaeda crashed two planes into the World Trade Center and killed, it was over 1,000 civilians, and caused, billions of dollars of damage. They also tried to crash a plane into the Pentagon. But the problem here with non-state actors, these are terrorist groups, and they're not a country. They are people acting on their own. So when we want to retaliate, we don't always know who we should be retaliating against. And so George Bush, obviously, he orders troops into Afghanistan and then into Iraq. But we were never really sure, understood the Iraq thing, about them having anything to do with 9/11. But we went into Afghanistan because we believed that's where Al Qaeda and Osama bin Laden were hiding out. Um, of course, we eventually find Osama bin Laden in Pakistan. And, you can see I wrote this slide a couple of years ago. We've been at war in Afghanistan and Iraq since 2000, 2002 was when we officially go to war. And so this is now the longest war in American history. Um, 3 presidents have overseen this war. Um, nobody has ever, brought all our troops home. I read a really weird statistic about how someone who signed up for the military after 9/11 2001 is now old enough for their child to be fighting in the same war their father fought in, which is kind of mind-blowing to think about. We don't really have a plan to end this war. The problem being is that some of these places like Afghanistan and Iraq are, the fear is that if we pull out, we lose all of the, I guess, quote unquote, progress that we've made there. The idea was that we wanted to turn these countries into, Western style democracies, and that as soon as we pull out, the Taliban and Al Qaeda and groups like this will take over again. So that's why we have not left, because we try and maintain stability there. It's one that we don't really have an answer to. We don't know when this is going to end, when we're going to, pull all our troops home. It may take another conflict somewhere else in the world for us to shift focus or something like that. But this was a major part of our foreign policy for a very long time. But today we don't even talk about it that much. Like, we're still at war, but you hardly hear about Iraq and Afghanistan in the media and things like that, because we honestly just don't have a plan for dealing with it. So this is kind of where we're at as far as war goes right now. Diplomacy. Diplomacy is the preferred method of foreign policy. Negotiation, and this is a good thing. Diplomacy is a good thing. Diplomacy. We want to avoid armed conflict, try to reach agreements through negotiation, and it's the best option for avoiding going to war. Our diplomatic structure was created by the Foreign Service Act in 1946. After World War II, we developed a formal mechanism for negotiation, and this would lead to the creation of the League of Nations, which would later become the United Nations. We have ambassadors in almost every country in the world, and those countries have ambassadors here. And the idea is that we keep these lines of communication open so that we don't have another World War II or something like that. The idea, Truman and many of the world leaders after World War II, they saw this devastation and said that, maybe next time this can be avoided. The problem is that negotiation is only as good as, honoring those agreements. And unfortunately for us, President Trump has caused a lot of disruption when it comes to diplomacy for the United States around the world. He's pulled us out of agreements that we have been a part of for, since World War II, with NATO. NATO is an agreement we have with Western European countries that if one of them is attacked, say, by Russia or China or something like that, that the United States will step in as an ally and all of the allies will step in to protect that country. Well, President Trump has disrupted those relationships, pulled some of our troops off bases in Germany, and has really kind of messed up relations with countries that have historically been our allies and always had our back. And has preferred negotiating with countries that we don't necessarily have great relationships with, like in the picture here, North Korea, Russia, places like that. But, he hasn't negotiated with them in a way that has been beneficial for the United States. And so the next administration is probably going to have a very big task of rebuilding some of the alliances and relationships that the United States has relied on for a very large chunk of our history. If President Trump wins again, it'll be interesting to see if he continues forward with this type of kind of aggressive, almost offensive type diplomacy that he's engaged in, or, who knows? He's very unpredictable. The United Nations, we just mentioned, they started in 1945. 192 countries are members of the UN. The 15 most powerful countries make up the Security Council, and there are 5 permanent members: China, France, Russia, the United States, and England. The rest are elected to the Security Council, but the idea of the United Nations is just that we have this place for countries to come together and try and reach agreements, negotiate. Sometimes it works out well, other times it doesn't. It just depends on how much faith we have in those countries to uphold their side of the bargain, and how much those countries value the United States, promises and commitment to uphold their side of the bargain, which, like we just said, has kind of come under question recently. We talked about sanctions. We talked about NATO, the International Monetary Fund. We won't touch on. I'm not. Y'all, if you get into political science, you'll learn all about all that kind of stuff. But the rest of this we've covered already, so I won't go into it again. There's a lot here to write about, but this is our last chapter, and it's kind of dense. So let me know if you have any questions about this material.